MAPS Canada is a charitable organization, and we do encourage donations. So if you're in a position to give, your support goes a long way in helping us work towards the legalization of psychedelics. Hello, and welcome to Psychedelic Peer Support, How to Trip Seed for a Friend. On behalf of MAPS Canada, our board of directors, and our incredible community of volunteers, we are so grateful that you're here today with us. I would like to thank our sponsors, Field Trip and Sport Labs, for making this event possible. All profits raised from this event will go towards funding MAPS Canada life-changing research. A quick note of what to expect during this session today. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Haden. Mark is the current executive director of MAPS Canada. He is also the clinical research advisor of Psygen, a Canadian company which offers manufacturing of psychedelic compounds. He is also an adjunct professor of the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health. He has been published on the issue of drug policy in the Canadian Journal of Public Health, the International Journal of Drug Policy, and he was involved in producing the Health Officers Council paper on the regulation of illegal drugs in 2005. And by the way, if you haven't read his papers on the legalization of psychedelics, they are fascinating. They're really interesting. Mark is also the author of the Manual for Psychedelic Guides, which describes the process of supporting someone using psychedelics for therapeutic or spiritual purposes. MAPS Canada acknowledges that humans are autonomous beings and they are free to take their own health-related decisions. So in order to ensure that everybody is safe, we need to provide people with the tools to use psychedelics properly, without encouraging them to use psychedelics in the process, of course. The information that will be provided in this session is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as medical advice. If you have any questions for Mark, you can submit your questions by clicking the Ask Question that should be there at the bottom, and we will get to them during the Q&A. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Mark Haden.
Hello, Mark. Antonio. What a pleasure to see you. Thank you for hosting.
Always nice to see you too, man. How are you today?
It's pretty good. It's a gorgeous sunny day in Vancouver, and it's interesting to watch where everybody's coming from. On the right of the screen, this is a national event. People have showed up from across Canada, which is completely wonderful. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome, and thank you for being here. Well, should we get to it?
Sure. Let's dive in the deep end.
Okay, so I think that the first question that anybody should consider before taking psychedelics is whether or not psychedelics are is there anybody who should not take psychedelics? Okay.
Yeah, there's lots of people that shouldn't. And it's interesting because in research, we call it exclusion criteria, that anybody with a significant mental health disorder that doesn't know what they're doing, things like bipolar and schizophrenia or any psychotic-based illnesses may get worse. Certainly when people are taking unknown dosages of unknown products, people need to be very, very cautious. So let's talk a little bit about the background to this, because what you're doing here, what we are doing in this conversation, is we're kind of stepping out of the research box. So really, I'd like to talk a bit about the manual and why I wrote it. Because what I'm aware of is that the manual is written really for both people who are being trained as professionals in the world of psychedelic space, and we are starting that now. We are actually expanding beyond our research with the special access program in Canada. So we're already talking about how psychedelics are going to be made available, and I believe there will be trained professionals. But I'm also aware that it's not that simple. There are a lot of people that want to use psychedelics outside of the context of research and may want to use them outside of the context of, a diagnosis, which is how they're going to be first available. So harm reduction is a concept, and the harm reduction says if people are going to use drugs, they should use them as safely as possible. And that's essentially the bottom line of this discussion, is how do you use drugs safely outside of the context of research and paid professionals? And so often there's a lot of overlap here. People, I think there are a lot of reasons not to use psychedelics. Let's start with that. You know, using psychedelics in an unsafe environment with people that you do not trust is a reason not to use psychedelics. Not knowing your source and your dosages is the reason to not use psychedelics. Having significant mental health backgrounds, many mental health backgrounds are reasons to not use psychedelics. So I think caution is really what I'm saying. Really a large dose of caution. And I've certainly been in this space for, you know, over a decade now. And people have told me awful stories. You know, I just took, you know, just 5 grams of mushrooms at some bar somewhere with some guy who I didn't really know. And bad idea. You know, I think really at the end of the day, what our discussion is going to conclude is we really need to be very, very thoughtful. We need to plan these things, and we need to be incredibly thoughtful about where we take them, who we take them with, what we take, and quite frankly, making a plan. And that's what you and I are going to talk about for the rest of this discussion, I think.
So, assuming that like someone has read the news and has decided to like take psychedelics, what should they consider before doing so?
So what do you consider before? Setting, safety, and dosage issues. So let's start at the end of that. So know the product that you're using, plan your dosage carefully, be able to you know, known products, and choosing dosages carefully, often starting with a small amount. You know, if you're a naive user, don't do a massive dose, do a small one, and learn to navigate that space before you take a larger dose. But let's talk about setting, and safety. Let's go through that. So set means who you are, your expectations, and what you bring to the event. You know, because, you know, are you happy on that day? Are you focused? Are you really distressed by something that's going on in your life? And somebody just throwing a wild card at you that is really upsetting. Those are all bad sets. You know, you need to be really, what we're looking for as a positive set is, I'm feeling good, I'm feeling confident, I'm ready for this experience, I have the time, you know, nothing else is bugging me, I don't need to take a call halfway through from, you know, something that's really, really important, an upset partner, you know, so all of the issues in my life can be put on hold for, you know, a day, or, you know, 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours. You know, so I can really just relax. I can put aside the issues of my life, and I can just focus on myself internally without being distracted by a lot of really negative things that are going to bug me. So that's the set. The setting is also important. You know, the setting should be safe. What does safe mean? It's not going to be intruded on by anybody. Nobody's going to come in. It's a quiet, safe environment where I can be internal. And we'll talk a bit about internal versus external, but internal means I'm just reflecting on myself. I'm not really engaged with the world at all. And my body is in a safe environment. So at very least, it should be safe. Nobody's going to come in. Nobody's going to try and talk to me. Nobody's going to have a conversation with me. I can lie down just as much as I want. Nobody's going to ask anything of me at all for this period of time. And so a safe environment is an environment where I'm not going to be intruded upon. The phone is not going to ring. My computer is not going to beep at me. I don't have any emails I have to respond to. And I can just lie down and not have to deal with anybody, or quite frankly, anything that's going to be intrusive.
So we have setting and safety. And so we are putting this event, and your manual is from the point of view of a trip sitter or a guide. What's the role of that person with the context of like setting and safety?
So to guide for somebody else, you know, the very simple definition, and we're going to dive into it much more deeply, is essentially having somebody who you trust that will not intrude on you and will take care of the environment. So whatever needs to be done in the environment, the person will go and do that thing. So you know that you are absolutely, quite frankly, irresponsible. You are not responsible for anything. You know, the guide is responsible. They are responsible for maintaining a safe environment where you are not intruded upon. That's the essential bottom line. But it gets a little more complicated than that, as we're about to find out. But it's who's going to manage the space and keep it safe and non-intrusive. it's interesting because the community tends to talk about, use the word holding space. Holding space is very common. You know, I'm going to hold space for you. I don't, it doesn't work for me because you're not really holding anything. And how do you hold space anyway? You know, so for me, the word being present, you know, being present for somebody is a little more accurate than holding space. So it's how can I be here for you is really the question. That's what the question the guide needs to ask. You know, and partly it's taking care of the details. You know, if there's, you know, if something happens, you know, the guide will take care of it. And the person who's lying down doesn't have to think about it, doesn't have to, there's no concern. All of the issues in the environment will be dealt with by the guide. That's the basics, but it gets a little more complicated as we dive into this.
Now, I have a question to go a bit deeper on the concept of the guide. There's almost like an idea that like to guide someone, there's like an active component involved into it. And I wanted you to like clarify that. What is the role of the guide during the psychedelic experience?
Well, let's talk about the word guide first of all. In the guide manual, I played with 3 words: sitter, guide, and therapist. And I rejected sitter because it's too inactive. It doesn't really, you're more than a sitter. You're not just sitting. There's more going on. I rejected the word therapist because often it's not about therapy. It's about a spiritual experience. It's about a reflective internal experience, but it's not a therapeutic experience. So I chose the word guide quite consciously and I also thought the word therapist was too active. You know, in fact, it's interesting looking at when we train therapists, you know, one of the issues that we find is the amount of unlearning people have to do. And often the longer somebody's being a therapist, the more unlearning they have to do. And the more credentialed people are, the more unlearning they have to do. So it's not about a therapist and it's not about a sitter. So I chose the word guide quite consciously after a lot of thought of somebody who's there and present and will play a role. But it's not about therapy. It's not a back and forth thing. It's not a, you know, I'm going to ask you all the right questions to solve the problem that you're struggling with in the time. That's not what it's about.
So what is it about? I want to get deeper into that because I personally was surprised when I read the protocols that they follow at like Imperial College, Johns Hopkins. I was surprised on how they conduct their sessions.
Yes. So let's just play with that. I mean, there's no one answer to that question. So let's just kind of play with it. So a guide is somebody who is able to sit in absolute presence and be calm and in control of themselves despite any turbulence that may be happening with the person who's lying down. So calm, the guide is calm. The guide is able to be reassuring no matter what happens. Because often, you know, a psychedelic space, it depends on what kind of dosage we're talking about. If we're talking about a higher dose, there's often an ego disorientation that occurs that can be kind of emotionally turbulent, you know, and so understanding that emotional turbulence and being able to simply sit with the person and assure them that they're doing absolutely fine. This is normal, this is fine, and a sense of absolute calmness. And I remember a paper that was written actually many years ago that was by the original group of people who are doing psychedelic research. And they did a literature review of when things went wrong in their research. And often what they concluded was that things went wrong when the guide became unsure of themselves. When the guide did not present with calm clarity and an ability to just absolutely reassure the person no matter what. That was the essential quality of whether the person, the subject in the research, had a good experience or a bad experience. So calm-centered presence is the essential quality of guide, the ability to remain calm in spite of what's often a pretty emotional and dramatic process.
Apart from being calm, are there any other traits that you would think or you would like that a good psychedelic guide should have?
Yeah, well, sure. Let's talk about, there's a woman who I like to bow deeply at the waist to. Her name is Janice Phelps. And she wrote a paper that talked about the 6 attributes of Psychedelic Guides. And I'd like to talk about those attributes and maybe add a few, you know. The first one was empathetic, abiding presence. Empathetic, abiding presence. I mean, those three words actually say a lot themselves. And so let's talk about that. So empathy, what is empathy? Empathy means I understand what you're feeling. I can really kind of be here because I can find the feelings that you are expressing in me, and I am absolutely okay with them in me. And so therefore I will be okay with them in you. So that's the empathetic piece, is I really deeply understand you as to what you're going through. The abiding piece means I can stay there. I can stay in this place. You know, it's not just something I kind of step into and then I go out to an email. You know, I can stay in the place of being empathetic for you for a long period of time, like hours and hours and hours. I can just hang out in this space of empathy with you. So I can really tune into your issues. So that means I'm not really paying any attention to me at all. You know, I have thoughts and I have feelings, and, you know, I've got, you know, discomfort in my whatever, you know, and I've got things going on in my life. And, you know, all of that stuff that I bring, I essentially put on hold. I do not think about me at all. I stay in the place of being tuned into you. That's the experience. You know, I don't get bugged by my own thoughts and feelings and discomforts and distractions. You know, one of the great arts of being a guide is not being distracted, and not being distracted by stuff that's going on for me. So, so being in a place of a guide is being empathetic, being there for the person and not being distracted. Mm-hmm.
Any other traits that you could consider essential?
Sure. So that was the empathetic, abiding presence. Sure. The second one is trust enhancement. You got to trust the person who's sitting for you, you know, and the person who is doing the sitting has to trust the person who's lying down. And so, you know, the model here, just maybe I'll go back a notch. The model is you take a psychedelic and you lie down. You listen to music, you have headphones on, and often you put on eye shades. So you really have an internal experience. Now, looking back on all the research that we've done, you know, mostly when people are doing MDMA and empathogenic kind of molecules, there's about half and half. There's half internal, half external. When people take one of the classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, dimethyltryptamine, you know, when you take the classics, people are really encouraged to be internal, you know, because there's more disorientation of the ego that happens. And so really you want somebody just to stay in that place and just stay inside and work with it and work with it. People may want to really come outside and talk for a little bit, but you know, you don't spend a lot of time talking. You know, you really encourage them to go back inside as quickly as possible. So the trust enhancement piece. So I need to trust the person. So the guide needs to trust the participant. And again, I chose the word participant quite carefully as well, because, you know, there's lots of other words out there, the subject and client and whatever else, but I chose the word participant to kind of reflect this back and forth process, that you are engaged with somebody. They are participating. The guide is not just doing it to somebody. There's a participant. They are participating in this process. So guide and participant, and the guide needs to trust the participant, and the participant needs to trust the guide. The participant needs to trust that the guide will not intrude upon them, that they will take care of the space and everything will be safe. And the guide needs to trust the participant that they will work to maintain, you know, their own feelings and work. They will honor the rules. We'll talk about the rules in a moment, but they will honor the rules. There are rules, and they need to talk about the rules right up front. And then the guide needs to trust that the participant will honor the rules, which is really, really important, because, you know, when things go wrong, the participant decides that the rules don't matter anymore. I'm going to go do whatever. And so, so really working with trust. So even in advance, having this discussion with people, I'm sure you're going to, sorry about that. Where was I? So in advance, you know, the guide and the participant need to talk about it.
Mhm.
And one of the things that they need to talk about is, how does trust work between the two of us? Do I trust you and do you trust me? And what does trust mean? And trust essentially means we all agree that we will do whatever we agree. You know, we will abide by the rules. You will play the role of guide. I will play the role of participant, and we're not going to change that. And so that's essentially what the trust is, that we will not intrude on each other, and we will do exactly what we said we would do. Is we will honor the rules, and that we all agree that this is what's going to happen. So trust enhancement. Trust enhancement means the guide needs to be really skilled at developing trust. So let's actually look at what the word trust means, because trust means a number of things. It means some level of, if you think about who you trust in this world and who you don't, the people that you trust, you can predict, and you believe that they will not harm you. So an element of predictability and an element of not harming are really the basis of trust. Is you're not going to hurt me, and I kind of know what you're going to do in the future. You know, I can kind of predict. You know, there's an element of predictability to trust. So talking about that, you know, openly with the person in advance. You know, do you trust me? What does trust mean to you? You know, can we predict each other's behavior? Can I predict that if I'm going to be the person lying down, can I predict that you're going to be there for me? You're not going to leave. You're going to take care of the environment if it needs to be taken care of. And do I just kind of know that you have my best interest in your heart? For the guide to trust the participant, it means, you know, I know that you are going to basically follow the rules, and you know you're going to do exactly what you need to do to participate in this process. So trust enhancement starts with talking about trust and what it means. Let's talk about the next one, which is spiritual intelligence. Often psychedelics are profoundly spiritual experiences for people. Not always, but often. And so the guide is really helpful if they have some sense as to where a psychedelic can take you in terms of spirituality. You know, oceanic boundlessness. I mean, reading what the questionnaire, the questionnaire that measures spirituality is called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. It's called the MEQ. It's an amazing questionnaire just to look at, because the questions are really quite outrageous. You know, did you experience oceanic boundlessness? I mean, wow, that's a great question. Did you experience that all is one? You know, so they really nailed the experience that people have. They asked a lot of people, what was it like for you? And they came up with a series of questions that actually work quite well. And so when the guide looks at the questions, they should understand what oceanic boundlessness means. They should have been there, quite frankly. And so when somebody goes to that place, they can resonate, again, back to that empathy piece. They understand because they've been there. You know, I think one of the questions that maybe you and I have in the future is, can a guide be a guide if they haven't had their own experiences?
I was going to ask you, what do you think?
I don't think so. I can't imagine how you could be, how can you be empathetic for somebody if you've never been to that space? Mm-hmm. So I think it's actually important to have been in that space and to have had your own experiences, because it's nothing. There's nothing else like it. You know, there's no breathing exercise. Breathing exercises are great. They'll take you to an ultra state of consciousness, but no breathing exercise will take you to, you know, X dosage of LSD or mushrooms, you know. So I think that you need to have had your own experiences, and quite frankly, you need to have been guided by somebody else. So you understand what it's like to have somebody who is completely there for you, and in a way that is not intrusive. So spiritual intelligence means you've been there and maybe even have a framework to understand it. And again, there's lots of different frameworks. You know, there's the Jungian archetypes. There's the Stanislav Grof, basic primal, you know, the birth primal matrices that he goes through, the model that he has. You know, there's lots of different models that people have proposed. I don't suggest any one of them, but I think understanding a number of them is helpful. And and understanding, you know, how we measure this stuff is also quite helpful, because those are the places that people go to. So spiritual intelligence is one of the basic guide that or basic attributes that is talked about. The next one is knowledge. A knowledge of, quite frankly, a variety of different substances, a knowledge of dosages, a knowledge of, interactions. What medications should somebody not be on? What's the interactions between SSRIs, like antidepressants? What if somebody's on that medication? Should they be taking a psychedelic? The short answer is probably not. But understanding why, and so the whole drug interaction thing. What drugs go with each other, what drugs don't go with each other, what prescription drugs do not work. The short thing is, you need to understand the concept of serotonergic medicines, because psychedelics are serotonergic, and so what other ones work with that same system, and so knowing what drugs people shouldn't be on, or what amplify and what decrease. So the knowledge piece is actually quite important, and it's accessible, and that you need to have that knowledge. Self-awareness and ethical integrity. So let's talk about self-awareness and ethical integrity. So the world of psychedelics invites self-reflection for everybody. It really does, and to be able to self-reflect in one's role of a guide is actually really important. And we'll talk in a moment or two about one of, in fact, let's talk about it now. One of the things that happens, I'm on a tangent. One of the things that happens during the psychedelic experience is the participant will project on the guide. There's two words, there's transference and countertransference that are the words used by therapists. Projection is also a common word that's used. So when you are the guide, you need to understand that you become part of the unconscious mind of the subject or the participant. Essentially, the subject will go, I'm saying the research word, the participant. The participant may look at you and see their father or their mother, or quite frankly, somebody who abused them, or, there's all kinds of emotional reactions that the participant will have when looking at the guide. And it's nothing to do with the guide. It's the projection of the participant. And so understanding that process, understanding projection and transference is absolutely vital, because you need to stay really calm when somebody sees you as being mother, father, daughter, or whatever, all of that stuff that we all carry. We all have stuff in our brains about other people. And all of that can come out and be dumped on the lap of the guide. And so understanding that is really, really important, because that's just part of the process. What happens is we go to the place of our unconscious mind. The psychedelics reduce the permeability between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And what's in the unconscious mind? Well, quite frankly, all kinds of stuff. And all kinds of stuff comes out, and often it comes out on the guide. And so understanding that that's absolutely fine. That's okay. I can be absolutely calm and centered and accept that you are projecting on me is a vital thing to understand when I'm in the place of guide. So self-awareness, the self-awareness piece of that is when you're projecting on me intensely, I know what's me and I know what's you. Now, that sounds pretty simple, but it can be very triggering. We as guides, we get triggered. We get triggered by other people's unconscious stuff. And really being able to work with that, work in the place of triggers, oh my God, this person thinks I'm whatever, and I am now having an emotional reaction based on that because I have a trigger. So the self-awareness piece means I need to be able to tune into that and know where my triggers are and manage that in a way that still takes care of the participant. My needs do not get managed now. My needs get managed later. The guide's need gets managed later. But right now, the guide is in the place of being empathetic and abiding and not getting triggered. In order to not get triggered, I have to understand where my triggers are. So, it's so the self-awareness piece is understanding how I need to stay balanced and not go off. But the ethical integrity piece, and that's huge. Ethical integrity is huge, because certainly what I see in the world of MAPS Canada and larger is that often ethical transgressions happen. And so playing, sticking by the rules, we make agreements and we stick with the agreement is basically about being ethical. And sometimes there are problems ethically. And so really staying in a place of ethical integrity is absolutely vital. And the final one that may not be relevant for this discussion, but is very relevant in the world of therapists, is proficiency with complementary techniques. So this is about therapy, so it's more than just guiding, but therapists bring all kinds of different techniques, and often they say, are the techniques that I am very comfortable with appropriate? And then the question is, what techniques do you use? Because some are appropriate and some aren't. Some body work is completely appropriate. There's, completely legitimate body work, therapeutic processes that work really well. And in the context of therapy, they're really good. Sort of internal family systems is really, really helpful as well. The essential model of that being, I carry around within me my father and my mother and all of the different family members that I grew up with, and I have those voices in me. So that's pretty helpful in the world of psychedelics. So that's a complementary technique that is really helpful. There are some techniques that aren't that helpful. A lot of back and forth verbally, cognitive behavioral work, not so helpful. So, but proficiency with complementary techniques is certainly part of the skill set.
So with regards to ethical integrity, I was wondering if we could cover really quickly some of the types of consent that have to be established in between the psychedelic guide and the patient. What was the term that you preferred?
Participant.
The participant.
The participant. Yeah. So I in my role as the executive director of MAPS Canada, I get to see stuff working really, really well, and I get to see stuff that doesn't work well. And I also get to talk to people in other cities and other countries. And what generally I believe that there is some kind of consensus that's building that there are four main kinds of problems that happen between the guide and the participant. So I want to talk about those four problems. And again, there'll be a bit of a flavor of therapy in what I say here, just because that's my work, right? So, I work in the context of psychedelic psychotherapy. So you have to just bear with me that's the way this particular section is going to go. So the four problems, I'll just name them and then I'll go through them in some detail. There's the great therapist syndrome, trauma projection, the attraction of predators, and the overbonding problem. So those are four problems. So I want to just go through them in detail. So what I observe is that it started, my career prior to being the executive director of MAPS Canada is I ran an addiction services program for a few decades with Vancouver Coastal Health. So I supervised therapists. That's what I did for my previous job. And mostly they were completely fabulous. They're wonderful people, really heartfelt, warm, wonderful, compassionate, kind, skilled people who I got to work with. And I feel honored and thrilled to be able to work with the people that I worked with. And occasionally I'd have a problem on my hands. And one of the problems that showed up, a number of people brought the same problem to the team because, people were coming and going over the decades that I did that. So one of the problems was I called the great therapist syndrome. And it became recognizable, once you do a job for long enough. And essentially what happens if you're going to be a therapist, and in this case, if you're going to be a guide, let's rephrase that. If you're going to be a client of a therapist, or if you're going to be a participant and you're going to have somebody guide you, you really need to believe that that person is wonderful. If you're going to bare your soul to a fellow human being, you really have to think that they're special, like really special, not just regular special, but really special. And most therapists or guides just take that with a grain of salt. They just know it's part of the process and they don't take it personally. Some people absorb that like a sponge. And they start to, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and sooner or later, they're actually a real problem to have in the staff meeting because they don't participate well with others because they're way better than everybody else in the room. And so the great therapist syndrome is actually a problem. And it's a problem not just for staff meetings, but it's a problem because it gives essentially the wrong message. And I'm going off on another tangent for a second, but you know, the essential model that I think is really, really helpful, and it came from Stanislav Grof originally, and then it was taken by Michael and Annie Mithofer, who are the main MAPS trainers, and they elaborated on it. And it's basically, I as a guide am here to witness your internal healer. So important, I'm going to say that again. I as the guide am here to witness. I'm here to witness your internal healer. And so in that process, I'm just a witness. You know, the healer is you. I'm not the healer. And some people get that completely wrong, and they really believe that they're the healer. And so if I believe that I'm the healer, I'm not going to be able to witness your internal healer. And so I will become, you know, the great therapist or the great shaman or whatever. You know, it happens in the psychedelic space as well, and or the great guide. You know, and then it's suddenly all about me as the guide. It's not about you anymore. And so, you know, it becomes a problem because the guide is there to witness the healer of the person. And so the great therapist syndrome essentially is both a problem in staff meetings, but it's also a problem because they don't see the internal healer of a person because they believe they're the healer. So that's the first problem that I see. The second problem that I see is we, partly because we work with PTSD, but partly just because we're humans, and we're involved with healing people, we attract therapists who have their own trauma history. And if they've had their own trauma history and they've done their healing, they're wonderful, they're fabulous. Man, they're really good at being empathetic. But if they haven't done their own trauma healing, they tend to see the world in a very narrow way, and it's full of predators and victims. And they play the predator-victim thing very quickly without really seeing the nuances, and they don't see things accurately because they bring their own filters to the table or the therapy room. And so, you know, the trauma projection problem is both a problem in staff meetings because, you know, they tend to play out that role with colleagues, you know, of seeing people in the room as being predators or victims. That's a problem, predators and victims, and that's a problem in the staff meeting, but it's certainly a problem when they play the role of guide because they won't see people accurately. They won't see people, you know, they won't, it's back to that empathy piece. If I have a big filter on that's the trauma filter, I'm not seeing you. I'm not seeing what your issues are. I need to let go of all of my issues in order to see your issues. And if I have a big thing going on in my head around trauma, it's an inaccurate filter. So trauma projection is the second problem that I see. The third problem that I see is, quite frankly, the attraction of predators. You know, when people are in the place of using a psychedelic, they are incredibly vulnerable. You know, and that vulnerability attracts people who are attracted to the vulnerability, attracted to the power differential, the fact that somebody becomes quite powerless when they're taking a psychedelic. Some people really like to be in that place, and I think the best word to describe them is predator. People who are attracted to the experience of powerlessness in other people, and that's a problem. You know, attraction of predators is a problem. And the final one is the overbonding problem. Now, I'm going to just use the language of therapy for a second, because the best predictor of success from any therapeutic process is the alliance, the connection between the therapist and the client or patient. So you really need a strong connection between those two people in order to have a successful outcome. And psychedelics are wonderful bonding agents, you know, especially, you know, the MDMA, MDMA, and 3-MMCs, the empathogen group are strong alliance builders. You know, the traditional psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, et cetera, are also pretty good alliance builders. But there's a point where there's an overbonding that happens, and essentially you become overbonded when you break the rules. You feel so connected to the person. I mean, just to be really blunt, no sexual touching is one of the rules. And so if suddenly there's a sexual touching process going on because of that bonding, you broke the rules. And so the overbonding problem is something that we also observe. You want a certain amount of bonding, but you don't want too much. And there is such a thing as too much bonding in this place. So I just call it the overbonding problem. So those are the four scenarios that I see that kind of really play themselves out again and again and again. And they play themselves out in different countries, in different cities. And quite frankly, I'm going to predict that they're going to continue to play themselves out, because those are going to be the problems that we need to face in the future. And I think the best antidote to them is being able to talk about them and being able to talk about them up front. And so I quite frankly think all training programs should have those four issues that are just part of the process and talk about them openly. And, in fact, as I used to supervise therapists, I only talked about the great therapist syndrome, but I would joke about it in the staff meeting. And I think all therapists have a great therapist in them. In fact, mine is kind of right there, just behind my right ear. And so I would joke about it. I would make I'd laugh about it and I'd make it funny. And then I would say, we all have it. And then when hopefully my great therapist doesn't get in the way, right? And it doesn't manifest. It's a small great therapist. It's not a capital G, capital T great therapist. But if you can kind of just talk about this stuff, it makes it easier. And so I think it's helpful to be able to have that discussion.
For sure. I want to get some time to cover. Sorry.
So I just saw somebody in the chat saying, can I reiterate what the four issues are? Yes.
Oh, of course.
So the great therapist syndrome, trauma projection, the predator, and the overbonding problem. And again, all of this is based on the guide that I've written, which is called the Manual for Psychedelic Guides. And it's all in there with lots of details.
Yeah, and I can insist how easy it is to read. I really appreciate that you made it very easy and accessible for everybody. I want to cover some of the details of the actual session. So you mentioned that preparation, set, and setting are really important when considering taking psychedelics. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. In particular, first intentions. How can one set intentions for a session?
So I think it's important to set an intention, but I also think it's important to be willing to let it go very quickly if it goes somewhere else entirely. But, why, it helps the discussion. Why are you doing this? If I'm in the place of a guide, hypothetically speaking, asking somebody, what is your intention? Why are you here today? What are you doing here? If the intention is, I really want to work on my historical relationship that I have with my mother, died 2 years ago and I never grieved. If that's my intention, it's kind of useful just to talk about that openly. If it's, I just want to trust the spirit teacher and see where they'll take me, okay, that's fine as well. So just kind of reflecting on why the person is doing it, it kind of sets a context for the whole session. Now, admittedly, some intentions get completely blown out of the water by the actual experience. So you don't want to be wedded to the intention, but to start with an intention, I think is very helpful.
And then within the set and setting, I wanted to talk about setting. What factors should one consider when setting a space for a psychedelic experience?
Yes. So the room or the series of rooms, there are some really crucial factors. Close access to a washroom. You don't want to be having to run down some public corridor to get to a washroom. So close access to a washroom that is private is really, really important. But generally, the setting should be attractive, maybe even spiritual or beautiful. Having access to nature, being able to see, a natural environment is helpful. Nature is beautiful. So inspirational art, and if people have a specific kind of religious or spiritual belief system, having the images of that belief system around them to help them go to that larger place. I mean, it's also interesting because I would describe psychedelics as generically spiritual. By that I mean, Christians find Christ, Buddhists find the Buddha, and agnostics or atheists find the entire universe, and that's fine. That's the way it is. So reflecting the spirituality and the positiveness of the person. If they want to surround themselves with sometimes people build a personal altar, and that can be very meaningful. Bring pictures that are really, really relevant for you. Pictures of your mother or your daughter or your dead grandmother who you just love so much, and things that are incredibly personal and relevant and helpful to manage this space is helpful. So building an altar in that space with relevant images, I think, is quite helpful. So yeah. Go ahead. It should be safe. It should be a space that is not going to be intruded upon, and it should have an element of beauty and spirituality and comfort.
What about the music? There's so much research right now in terms of like music and how music affects the psychedelic experience, and I was wondering if you could add something to that. Well,
sure. I think that there are certain playlists that you can find that are helpful. Now, I actually found it interesting. I went and listened to the John Hopkins playlist, that is probably the most famous playlist. And to be honest with you, it was very traditional classic pieces mostly.
It's been researched, right?
I think that there are many musicians that have really catered their music toward the psychedelic space. And, we have a local musician here who shows up at many of our events. Her name is Theta Phoenix. And she shows up at, the concerts, not the concerts, but the conventions and various events. And she's wonderful. She plays these crystal bowls. It is just, she's channels spirituality. I mean, so really finding that kind of music, and the guide should be skilled. The guide should know. And really, there are kind of three different. If you're designing a playlist for a psychedelic experience, it really goes through three stages. On the first stage, the person is probably somewhat anxious. So as they take the psychedelic drug, what you want is the playlist to be calm, really strong calming elements. So it's very soft, gentle, calming music. And then it changes, and that's for the first hour and a half. And then it starts to become a little more engaged with the spiritual experience. And I think in my book I recommend the ones that I think are quite frankly the best. They're very popular, and people who actually sell music for psychedelic experiences tend to have a group of them that are consistently used in psychedelic spaces. And then at the end, it can be a little more upbeat. Maybe the person wants to get up and move a little bit. So, towards it, it can be just you being lying down for a few hours. So getting up and moving a bit, the sense of, I've just been through this amazing experience. And then the final songs, I think, should be celebratory, like you've done this amazing experience. It's a Wonderful World, for example. Those kind of sort of celebratory music that, wow, well done, you did it. So I think some thought needs to be put into, the psychedelic playlist with the understanding that there are different stages that people go through. And the recommendations that I have are all in the book.
I was reading through the questions, and I think that this goes really well with my next question. So once a person is going through a psychedelic experience, how can a guide help that person deal with feelings of anxiety, extreme emotion, or any kind of difficult experiences that may arise during experience?
Yes. Calmly. Really, really calmly. So calm reassurance that it's absolutely okay. Trust the medicine. Any psychedelic guide that's good will have a series of phrases that they are absolutely and completely comfortable with, like trust the medicine, trust the process, just be with it, go with it. If I really think about what goes wrong in psychedelic space, it's about I'm having an experience and I don't like it, I'm fighting it. So not fighting. So, in setting people up for the experience, saying things like, You know, if you see a staircase, go up. If you see a door, open it. I mean, one of the analogies that I find quite helpful, that I think may be even helpful to talk about in advance of the psychedelic experiences, is canoeing in a canyon.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I love canoes. I love canoes. I've been canoeing all my life. In fact, I once told my mother, who has Alzheimer's, that I was born in a canoe, and she looked at me and said, "Really?" I'm tangenting. So I love canoes, and I've done canyon canoe trips. So a canyon canoe trip is a little different from other canoe trips because you're really committed. You know, once you're in a canyon, there's only one way out, and it's down. It's down the river. You cannot, you know, you can't get out on the banks and find a road because there's this huge rock walls between you and the roads. So there's an element of commitment with a canyon, and there's also an element of commitment when you take a psychedelic, because once you've ingested it, there's only one way out, and that's down the river of time. So you start with being committed, and that's similar to a canyon. But then within that commitment, understanding that in the canyon, there's often canyons that I've done anywhere happen to be in desert, and they're often pretty windy. And so you can actually have a problem with the wind. So the wind will either blow you up or blow you down or blow you sideways. And so understanding that can be some very intense environmental aspects to a canyon canoe trip is helpful, because they're also in the psychedelic space. You know, the environment that you take it in, the room that you take it in, the people that you take it with, the music are also very strong influencers of the experience. But then in a canyon, when you're in a canoe, you also have a paddle. You know, while the wind may be blowing you, you can make choices as to where you go because you can paddle a canoe. And so the analogy in psychedelic space is, you know, you actually do have choices as to where you go. You know, you may want to look at your relationship with your mother, but you know something, you may not. You may say, you know, I actually don't want to look at that right now. I would like to look at my whatever. I would like to go somewhere else. And so you can actually say, I don't want to look at that now, and I do want to look at that now. And so you do make choices, and understanding that you make choices is helpful. So that's kind of the paddle piece of the experience. And then there's the, what do you do if things go wrong? So in a canyon, you have prepared for the fact that things may go wrong. Quite frankly, your boat may dump. So, you know, you've tied all your gear into the canoe, and you have dry bags, and you, quite frankly, you have a life jacket, and you know how to manage the situation if things go wrong. So exactly the same is true in a psychedelic space. And the analogy there is, what do you do when you're really feeling out of control? Well, you focus on your breath. You go back to breathing, and you really work with focusing on the breath. And so a meditative technique that allows you to focus on your breath is the life jacket that you use in psychedelic space. And so that's a really handy analogy. It works well for people to understand that you make choices and how to set up the experience.
I really like that analogy. So I also feel that a lot of people try to resist the experience, especially if they come upon like really strong emotional feelings. What kind of mantra, what kind of word or idea they can hold during that experience? Is there anything that you recommend those people to like think, or
well,
like the guide to use?
Essentially, I would have that as a discussion that I'd have with the person in advance. I would say, what do you do to calm yourself down? I mean, maybe a mantra works well for people. Maybe just focusing on the breath works well for people. So there's no one answer, but I think the understanding that it's important to be able to do that. And you know, we all experience anxiety, you know, anxiety is a human experience, and we all got it. So how do we manage that in us as humans? What do we do, you know, and what techniques have you done already? You know, how do you manage a job interview? Because that's an anxiety provoking experience. Hopefully you take long, slow, deep breaths, but maybe you have some other technique. What technique do you use to calm yourself down when you experience anxiety? I think that's a very helpful discussion to have had in advance.
I think that's a great idea. And then once a person has gone through the peak of the experience and they are like in their calm down, how what's the role of the guide then?
Well, there's a point. I mean, it depends on the medicine, but there's a point at which sort of conversation is fine, so, the 6-hour point with LSD, when really it's subsiding substantially, but you're not down yet. At that point, maybe the person does want to become external, internal being lying down with ICAs on and headphones, external being in conversation. So at that point, maybe somebody does want to say, wow, what was that like? They want to talk about their experience. And so the role of the guide is just to reflect and not to interpret and not to just to say, wow, this is what I hear you saying, just to really be skilled at reflective listening. So, I hear you saying that was amazing when you went and you found your mother. Wow, what was that like for you? Is a reflective listening response, as opposed to, I really don't think that you should be talking about your mother that way. I mean, that's a judgmental response, right? So, a reflective listening response, and really being comfortable with being able to summarize what you heard and reflect it back. And it takes some skill to do that. It's not something that comes naturally to people. So reflective listening, I heard you say this, and just kind of being there for that is helpful in that process.
And in the manual, you talk about the difference in between invitation and direction, how language should be used to properly. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, so the goal is to invite but not direct.
Mm-hmm.
So even the example I used is, if you want to connect with somebody, and you say the word breathe, or breathe, take long, slow, deep breaths, that's directive. And that's not as helpful as just watching the person breathing, just tuning in. Again, being empathetic means noticing their breathing. How are they breathing? Are they breathing long, slow, deep breaths or short, shallow breaths? And then starting to match your breathing to them, and then talking about just breathing and doing it in a way that is in sync with the person. So you can actually help somebody to breathe differently if you match your tone and how you're saying your words to their breathing. And so that's, again, the empathy piece. You start to really notice what's going on for the other person. And so you're not directive in any way. You're not telling the person to do anything, but you're just kind of providing some guidance in terms of being calm and focused.
And once that conversation has been, so once that person is like out of like the afterglow part of the experience, is there any particular way that you like to close a session, or like is there a way that you recommend people to approach that idea of like closing and terminating the session?
Well, it's interesting because I talk about how rituals can be helpful in the book. And doing opening rituals and doing and hit ritual. If you think about the function of ritual behavior in all indigenous communities that use psychedelics. So I'm talking about ayahuasqueros and peyote, road men, the curanderos use of mushrooms. They all are highly ritualistic without a lot of words, and it really makes sense to me because rituals are a way of intervening without words, because words don't work very well in psychedelic space. So you need to have a way of communicating and being there for people. And often rituals actually provide that language of healing and connection without actually any words, because words often don't work. So often at the end, there can be you can be ritualistic behaviors to open and ritualistic behaviors to close. So I think rituals can be quite wonderful if they are in sync with the person. You need to, I've watched a lot of shamans do their thing. And if what they're doing is in sync with the participant, it works well. But I've also seen shamans do rituals that aren't in sync with the person, and I think that becomes a problem. So being able to adjust rituals to fit the person, I think, is really helpful. So even talking about that in advance, what would be a celebratory ritual that we could do at the end? And often it comes down to, something that's positive and honors the transition and the experience for people, and often involves some healthy food as well. When you start to eat, people get hungry at about the 8-hour period. So, having some food is really helpful to, bring the blood sugar back up again and allow one to go out and meet the world with some food in the stomach, but really healthy, light food that is whatever it works for the person in terms of their dietary preferences, but healthy and light, but has some blood sugar component to it.
Yeah, I found that part of the manual interesting. Is there any literature that you would recommend in regards of like ritualizing the process of using psychedelics? I'm curious to know if like there's any more information that like you can refer us to.
Yeah, I think I have some references there that are helpful in terms of that, of how to do it. There's lots of different types of rituals that people use, and so I think you kind of pick and choose, quite frankly. I think weaving together a ritualistic structure, and I think I have references that you can, if you want to do the deep dive in that, I have some references you can go find.
We can, yeah, I think I was just trying to remember what you mentioned in the manual. Sorry, but I think that people can go and read it there. So once it's something that I learned a while back is that the psychedelic experience doesn't end after the effects of the drugs are over. There's a period after that now is known as integration. And I was wondering if you could speak about the importance of integration, or what integration is first. Yes.
So yeah, I think you nailed it. What you said, the psychedelic does not end at the when the substance is out of your body, the effect may not be. So I think recognizing that for some people, there is a period where they feel somewhat destabilized. Many people just feel the afterglow, and if the next day is wonderful. But that's not what all people experience. So a good guide understands that it isn't just positive. And sometimes there's actually, quite frankly, an amplification of anxiety that happens the next day. And so if the person gets a hold of you the next day and say, oh my God, I feel crazy, I feel more anxious, I feel destabilized, the guide needs to be able to look at them very, very calmly and say, yes, that's completely fine. That's okay. That's normal. And, have some suggestions, whatever, all the normal healthy things you do is, exercise a little bit, eat a healthy diet, just don't get just aware that this is actually okay. It's part of the process. It's sometimes a turbulent process, and turbulence is just part of it. So that's part of it, is being able to be calm and reassuring if people feel that, something's gone wrong. That's part of it, but it's more than that. Acting on the insights that people formed. Often there are intense insights. So encouraging people to act, but act appropriately. So don't immediately quit your job or divorce your partner. That you just don't do anything immediately. Just wait a little while. Just kind of sit with this thought that you have that you really want to quit your job. Maybe you do want to quit your job, but sit with it for a while. So integration means really pondering the insights and allowing the insights to bear fruit over a period of time. Working with relationships around it. One of the things that I've certainly heard more than one person tell me is, they've gone home from a psychedelic experience to somebody who is not supportive. And it was really hard. The person mocked them or really didn't understand what they had been through. And so being able to talk about the people in one's life that one goes back to, and were they welcoming of this experience or incredibly unwelcoming. So that's part of integration as well, is working with the social environment when you want to talk about these experiences. And also just, did I have any insights that I actually do need to change? Maybe I do need to quit my job. And that is something I do need to do, that after I thought about it for quite a while, I actually just need to go and quit my job. So then acting on it after some period of reflection has passed. Mm-hmm.
And especially if there are lingering feelings of anxiety or insecurity, are there any resources out there for people to help them integrate these feelings?
All of the sort of normal, healthy, therapeutic things that we do with ourselves around feelings. How personally, talking about me, How do I manage my feelings? Well, sometimes they feel pretty turbulent at times, and they feel a little out of control, and I kind of sit with them, and I kind of just sit with them and hope that, I can just manage this internal bucking bronco of the human experience, the human incarnation. We all have it. So, wise internal reflections that allow me to process my feelings, perhaps talking about them with somebody that I trust, or just allowing myself to give expression to them, or not. How do you manage the internal turbulence of being a human being? Because quite frankly, being a human being is not an easy experience. It's really difficult. Quite frankly, it's really difficult for all of us. And hopefully we develop some wisdom over our lifetime about how we manage interactions with people and our own internal feelings and thoughts.
And in terms of looking for a therapist who could help process these feelings, how could you recommend people looking for that? Because I feel that a lot of therapists might not be qualified or might not be ready to discuss psychedelic experiences.
Yes. Well, the buzzword is therapists who hang out on their shingle of the fact they do integration work. Mm-hmm. And there are increasing number of therapists that do that, and you got to go and talk to the person and figure out if you trust them or not, and is this going to be a good fit for you or not. So there's no one suggestion I have there, but being willing to find somebody that can help with that turbulence. Yes.
I guess you have to work that therapeutic alliance with that therapist too. So there's some work involved with that. Yeah. And how long does the integration process take?
The rest of our lives.
Yeah.
It's hopefully, I think, people who take who have woven the psychedelic experience into their lives with, either loved ones or friends or whoever, are kind of on a journey, and the journey is a journey of self-reflection and it doesn't end, it goes on forever. There's no end. It's just the journey. There's no end.
It is. I feel that a lot of people think that kind of soul searching will end, that once you start looking into it, you realize that it doesn't. It's a continuous search. So
I think so. Yeah. Or at least maybe, I haven't ever met the guru yet who's enlightened, so I maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it does end for some people, but I've just never met them.
Maybe there's someone there who can resolve that problem of
maybe out there, but they haven't contacted me yet.
So I think this is a good point to jump into the questions.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, I saw some that are really interesting. So the first one is by Keith, and he asks, I want to sit for my parents who are in their late 60s and they're on board. They have no major health issues, but I'm nervous about their age regardless. Can you recommend how one might approach sitting for older people using psilocybin? Any recommendations other than having them get an okay from their doctors, and then they worry that their doctors might not be the right person to give them advice about psychedelics?
Yeah, that's kind of a tough question. Quite frankly, I'm in my late 60s. So, I'm aware of a community of people that use psychedelics well beyond their 60s. But generally, I think the issue is overall health. If you can, go for a brisk hike, you're probably fine to do a psychedelic, because, if you can't go for a brisk hike, you are cardiovascularly compromised. And so I would think general overall health is important. But if you have significant medical issues, you might want to think about that. But as I say that, an alternate thought pops into my mind is people, the Section 56 exemptions right now that are happening for psilocybin are for people at the end of their lives. So they're all have major health complications. Basically, they're dying, and often they're within days and weeks of their death. And so, and they do that completely intentionally as they're dying, and it's very helpful for them. So if I was going to be a guide, I would want somebody to be generally healthy, but I completely understand end-of-life care as well. So I'm giving you contradictory information, and I hope you can sit with that.
I think they have different situations, but so I think there's another question here that relates to that. So the question is from Alicera, and she's asking about dosage, especially for beginners. how do you think a person should approach a psychedelic experience with no background? So like if someone was to like use psychedelics for the first time, what advice would you have for them in terms of like dosages?
Generally, I think it is wise not to start with a heroic dose. I think that learning to navigate psychedelic space first is healthy. And so if you want to know about dosages, go to arrowid.com. It's a harm reduction based site that talks a lot about dosages and all the possible problems that can happen. So it's a huge site that is actually very helpful. It's EROWID. And so starting small and learning to navigate the space and relax into it and trust it, I think is helpful. So, small, medium, and large. So work your way up slowly is my recommendation. And certainly having lengthy times off between experiences. One of the things about psychedelics is they tend to build a huge tolerance immediately. So you don't want to, spend every day doing a psychedelic. I mean, nobody would want to do that. So you have a psychedelic experience, you wait weeks, months, years, and then you have another one that's a higher dosage, and you slowly escalate with time.
Yeah, people don't think about that too much. I think I read that Anne Solgen did so much MDMA at some point in her life that later she could have MDMA and just fall asleep. So it is very important to leave periods of time to recover and to process a lot of the thoughts that come during the psychedelic experience. There's another question here by Mike Johnston, and he's asking, what examples are important things therapists must unlearn in training to be psychedelic guides?
Oh, I love the question. It was interesting when I did the MAPS training. Michael and Annie Mithofer showed a series of videotapes. And I mean, we sat and we watched videotapes for hours and hours and hours and hours, 10 hours a day. It was hard on the body to sit there that long. But after they turned the videotape off, and it was a group of therapists in the room, and they would say, "What would you do next?" And then we would, as a group, go around and we would have a discussion about what we would do. And fairly often, in fact, fairly often, the therapists in the room would say, "Well, I would say this." And inevitably, Michael and Annie Mithofer would come back and say, "No, what you do is nothing. You do not say anything. You just witness. You're there to be there for the person. You're not there to engage them with your wisdom. That's not your role. You're not there to ask the right question. You're there to kind of be there for them. You're not there to engage." So the art of sort of compassionate presence and really being there for people without words is one of the biggest things that therapists have to unlearn. Therapists are really good at the back and forth. And they're not really good at sitting there, not saying anything. So that's the main thing that therapists unlearn.
There's a question here related also to psychedelic therapy and how to become a psychedelic therapist. And I feel that you have answered it before, but it's always good to remind people. So Josie is asking, I understand that we're discussing guiding outside of research, but can you discuss how you see professional guiding progressing and how someone can get involved at this time, especially in Canada?
Well, certainly we are going to legalize psychedelic medicine. So I don't know how it's going to unfold. There's multiple tracks of legalization that we're on right now. There's the track of the MDMA within the context of a diagnosis. And that will be, prescribed physician and therapists that have been trained by MAPS USA and within the context of the therapeutic room and everything else. It'll be a therapeutic process. That's one model. But there's other models, the Section 56 exemptions that are being granted for psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety is completely different. And they're training people differently for that experience. So it's really hard to say how it's going to unfold in the future. But certainly there are a number of different models. In fact, just to add some complexity to this, how you sit with somebody with the classics with LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline is different from how you sit with somebody with MDMA and MDA and 3-MMC, just because they tend to be a little more empathetic and more engaged. And how people work with their unconscious material is a little different with the different psychedelics. So there's no one answer to that. That's quite a complicated question.
What, like right now, what are the criteria that MAPS is looking for to train therapists? Do you have to be a psychotherapist to qualify for that?
So currently, there, and what I believe will happen in the future is they want to provide the context within dyads. So dyads means two guides, male, and usually it's male and female. It doesn't have to be male and female. If somebody really wants two males or two females, I can understand that. But the norm is male and female, so two guides, so a dyad. And one of the dyad should be a licensed professional who reports to a college. So a licensed psychologist, a licensed social worker, a licensed nurse, a psychiatrist that is active and licensed and reports to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. The other one doesn't have to be. So really, there's a balance here that is being trying to be achieved. When things go wrong, having a college that somebody reports to reduces the chance of things going wrong. But the more credentialed people are, the more inaccessible the service becomes because it becomes more expensive. So having one person that isn't licensed and the other person that is seems to be the kind of balance that MAPS has come up with. And so I'm trusting that that's what they will move forward with. But really, the fact that we're having this discussion means that's only one path of legalization. I mean, cannabis didn't get legalized in Canada because it was turned into a medicine by Health Canada. It was legalized by popular opinion. And so maybe some politician will someday saying, these things shouldn't be criminalized. They're not particularly harmful if used skillfully, and the police shouldn't be playing a role in this world. So how do we take this out of the realm of the police? Well, we should make them available, and how we make them available should be maybe wider than just medicine. And so people should be allowed to access these things and sit with friends and sit with partners, and it should be bigger than that.
Yeah. To anybody who's curious, what's the title of your paper on the legalization of psychedelics?
Well, if you just Google Haden and psychedelic legalization, it's free. You can go, or it's on my website, markhaden.com. But it's pretty quick to Google it. My name plus legalization of psychedelics, or regulation. That's the word, regulation of psychedelics.
I love that model. I love the model that you proposed in that paper.
Thank you.
So getting back to the questions, there's a couple of people who are talking about interventions when the participant becomes psychotic or self-harming. I believe that someone who's make us self-harm or danger to others. What would you recommend if a person is becoming unstable and dangerous to themselves or to other people?
Okay. So that's a very interesting question. So if somebody is becoming violent to themselves or somebody else, now hopefully they won't, because you set them up well, right? So the setting up experience. So really it's about prevention, not treatment. You anticipate things and you talk about the rules, and you talk about setting people up, and you've screened somebody who knows how to navigate psychedelic space. But let's just say everything's gone wrong. So let's talk about the rules. Let's talk about the rules. We never actually talked about the rules yet. So the rules are no sexual touching and don't leave the space, and nobody gets harmed. There's no objects or people that get harmed. So no harming, no sexual touching, and don't leave the space. Those are the three main rules. And so if somebody wants to break those rules, they want to leave the space. I really got to get out of here. I must leave the space. So it's really helpful to have had as a guide, to kind of practiced a little bit and to think about what would you say that is repetitive, connecting, and boundary setting. I'm going to say that again. What would you say that is repetitive, connecting, and boundary setting? So think that through in advance. So something like I see you want to really leave. I get it. I really understand that you want to leave. That's the empathetic piece. But you know something? We agreed to stay in this room. And you know something? This is the safe space, and we're going to just see this through together. So I'm going to actually ask you to stay in the room. That's a statement that has an empathetic component to it and a boundary setting component to it. And so having that kind of statement that you can just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. I know this is difficult. I understand this is difficult. I got it. This is difficult. And we agreed to stay in this space. And so we're going to see this through together. Sometimes the appropriate intervention is just changing something, changing the music. The music isn't working and it's stimulating somebody to feel something. Change the music, do a ritualistic response. Pair a gong with change so that, as you ring the gong, something changes and you kind of set people up for that experience. So you take a long, slow, deep breath and you say, okay, it's time. And you ring the gong and then you have something to distract the person with. There's all kinds of really interesting cards out there. There's animal cards and angel cards and O cards and whatever. There's all these kind of spiritual cards. In fact, there's a bookstore near me called Banyan Books that has a whole wall of spiritual cards. They're beautiful. Haul out a card. Say, it's time to look at this. I'd like to show you something. And you haul out a deck and you open it up and you talk about one of the, whatever, the animal spirit or the emotion that's the card is reflecting, or find a way of distracting the person with something positive and engaging, and get people to calm down, take long, slow, deep breaths. So even the language that you use and the tone of voice that you use is really, really important. Because if I say to you right now, Antonio, if I say, I'm not really anxious right now, I've given you two messages. One, the message of my words is I'm not anxious. The message of my tone of voice is I'm extremely anxious. So working with one's tone of voice is probably more important than the actual words. So be calm and be willing to speak calmly to the person no matter what. And that takes a certain element of self-control when somebody's feeling intense feelings, but it's really, really important.
There are people asking whether there are any pharmacological interventions that you would recommend for a difficult trip. Is that something that you would recommend, people having benzos or sleeping pills or something to counteract the effects of psychedelics?
I'm going to just tangent for a second. The question that I see is the question about nature. So where you're reading is not what I'm seeing. So
yeah. We can go there. Yeah.
Okay. So, but nevertheless, pharmaceutical intervention. So the short answer to that question is, I hate to say this, but benzodiazepines do calm people down emotionally. And so what researchers tend to have is a benzodiazepine, Ativan, for example, that they keep in the back burner just in case, because benzodiazepines are very calming. That's what they do. But really, you don't want to use them. You really want to avoid them whenever possible. So it's kind of the last ditch intervention when all of your calming things are done. If you have access to, in the world of research, we do have access to benzodiazepines. They are always there, but you really try not to use them just because that introduces a whole other element.
Mm-hmm. I think I agree. Someone mentioned on the chat that if the situation gets out of control, the guides would call 911. And I wonder, is that something that needs to be discussed before the experience? Is that something you recommend?
No, you never want the ambulance showing up. I mean, if you have a medical emergency, if somebody is having a heart attack, yeah, you phone an ambulance. But that's the very, very, very last thing you would ever do. I mean, if somebody is really, doing what is described as a medical emergency, a psych emergency, no, you got to be there. That's what guidance is all about. But yeah.
Yeah, they're saying that they meant life-threatening. I just wanted to bring that up. I think it's an important thing. But let's talk about
yes.
And then someone mentioned Fireside. Yeah, big shout out to Fireside. It's something that is really interesting. Let's talk about nature. So we talk about experiences indoor. What about experiences and outdoors in nature? What are the factors that need to be considered?
Yes.
In that kind of situation?
Yeah, that is a completely, common experience that people have is, a safe natural environment. Again, it has to be a safe natural environment. So what does that mean? It means, I got to reflect for a second. So it's funny because many people actually have their first psychedelic experience at outdoor music festivals. Yeah. And to be absolutely honest with you, I can't think of a worse environment. You're full of people that you don't know. You're often either in the burning sun or it's raining on you. So for me, it's the wrong setting. But I could imagine a natural environment being in the forest where you are with a guide who does have water and food and blood sugar stuff and is able to kind of guide you if you really need to do something. So natural environments, are actually quite wonderful. And so external environments can be quite beautiful. They're different though. The experience tends to not be as reflective. If you want to have an internal guided experience where you're going inside and kind of looking at your issues, it's a little different from having an external experience. I mean, both are wonderful, but you pick and you choose. What do you want to have? Do you want to bond to nature and really, really appreciate the wonder of the forest and get in tune with the planet? That's an exterior experience. If you want to kind of, go find what your relationship with your mother was all about, that's an internal experience. And you make that choice. Both are wonderful, so long as the natural environment is safe.
Mm-hmm. There are many questions about dosages and negative effects of psilocybin, MDMA. Where can people find information about like the pharmacological aspect of psychedelics?
Some of it is in my guide. I talk about, contraindications in terms of other medicines. And the woman who did that piece of it is a pharmacist, and she really did a deep dive. She really explored that with some level of rigor, and I really appreciated her. Her name was Trina Nguyen. And so I deep out of the waist for that piece of the guide that she wrote. Also, Arrowhead is actually quite helpful for that kind of stuff. And you can go in and look at trip reports and what people say if you want access to a huge database around what people are talking about. I think that's helpful.
Okay, let's see what questions we have here that we haven't addressed yet. Someone is asking how you would recommend people with mental health history or like use of medications to work with psychedelic therapy. That should they go work with like a licensed therapist only, or do you recommend like that those people should not approach psychedelic therapy at all?
I'm getting a tangent for a second. So where are you reading that question? Because what I see
I'm going through the list and I'm trying to like find, but if you find any question that is particularly interesting to you, we can just like go.
Let's just work our way down the list here.
Of course. So negative psychological aspects of psilocybin. What are the main aspects?
The question is, what are some common negative physiological effects or manifestations of psilocybin? So not psychological. So the body.
My bad.
The body. So what? Okay. There can be raised heart rate. There can be an increase in blood pressure. Mostly now in the research world, they don't monitor blood pressure anymore because it's not seen as a concern, which is a great relief to many people because you used to have to do all of this blood pressure stuff periodically, which was really irritating. So essentially, physiologically, it is not harmful. You don't see a lot with people physiologically. You don't see massive effects with that. The psychological effects are huge, but the physiological effects may be raised heart rate. That's about it.
So we talk about like how to react if the person becomes psychotic.
Okay, let's talk about that. So
okay.
So let's talk about the roots of that question. What happens when a person takes a dose that causes them to become psychotic? So I guess I'm not sure that I understand the question, because is the question referring to at the time, or is it referring to feeling destabilized the days afterwards? Because there's been a huge number of people that have gone through the research process so far, with both psilocybin and MDMA, we can look at, it's called adverse events. So the adverse event analysis of all of the research essentially says that psychedelics, if well handled and well managed, do not create psychotic experiences afterwards. So sometimes people feel that psychotic is such a strange word because it means so many different things to so many different people. I mean, what the word that's used in the world of psychedelics is disorientation of the ego. And one can say it's the same thing. When one's ego becomes disoriented, that could be the same as psychosis. It's not, we don't use the word psychosis, we use the word disorientation of the ego. So really when I'm in a psychedelic space, the experience can be the sense of self changes. One sense of self dramatically changes, and you become something different. One's ego. What is one's ego? One's ego is one's sense of self. It's, and if I'm talking about me, I'm talking about what defines me as me, my sense of Mark Haden in this world. What do I do? What is my personality and all the things that, the attributes that come together to create this experience of a human being in a body with a purpose and intention and a family context and all that stuff. And a dog that whines at me every once in a while, right about now. So that's my ego, right? So that becomes disoriented often in psychedelic space. And that's okay. In fact, it's actually desired. You really want to have a disoriented ego because it's the ego that structures one's life experience. And if you want to kind of rethink life a little bit, that structuring really needs to be shaken up a little bit if you're going to think about life differently. And that's kind of the goal of the whole thing. So I wouldn't use the word psychotic because that's all associated with a mental health diagnosis. I would use the word disorientation of the ego, and it's absolutely fine. In fact, it's often associated with profound and positive changes.
Someone was asking about how much time should there be between MDMA sessions? Is that something that you want to talk about?
Yes. When I look at people who I consider to be real experts in this, they do say that MDMA should be used infrequently. Now, what does that mean? It means you're not doing it every weekend. If you're using MDMA to party, quite frankly, I think it's a complete waste of MDMA because MDMA can be so amazingly useful as an internal exploration tool. But, we all have our biases. I'm reflecting my bias. But doing it frequently, by that I mean even every weekend, I think it's too much. So, every few months is what the recommendation is from the experts. And the question there, I mean, it's not solid science. It's how long does it take to rebuild one's serotonergic system? Because you use a lot of serotonin when you're taking MDMA, and how long does it take to re-achieve that balance? I think generally speaking, psychedelics shouldn't be taken frequently. They should be an infrequent experience in one's life, so months is not an unreasonable answer to that question.
So we have 5 minutes above time. Do you want to answer maybe 1 or 2 more questions and then call it a day? Okay. So next one is, I just want to make sure that you're feeling not too tired. What are to you the most interesting or compelling theories that explain the therapeutic qualities of psychedelics?
Oh, interesting.
Tough.
Oh, wow. To be absolutely honest, I would like to acknowledge that we don't know. We don't know why psychedelics are as therapeutic as they are. And I think that, there's tons of stuff that's been written on it. I mean, I quite like Stanislav Grof's work. I think he's great. But I don't think that we have an answer yet. I think that we can see the outcome, we can see the healing potentials, but we don't really have an answer to the question as to why it works so well. So I think it's a huge question, and I think that we will answer over time. I also find the world of neuroscience really interesting, and how when a person looks at brain activity or reduction of activity, and I try to map that onto what people are talking about. It's like, wow, it's really hard. It's a hard thing to see the connection sometimes. So I think the question is important, and we have only started to scratch the surface of the question.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I have no background on neuroscience, but it's definitely complicated. Okay, one last question. So, could you explain why SSRIs can be taken at the same time than psychedelics?
So, SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So, it's an antidepressant. The theory of it is, and there's also people that challenge the theory, is that it prevents serotonin from being pulled back into the synapse. And so their SSRIs are serotonergic medications. And when you're already changing your serotonergic system and then you're taking a psychedelic that works with that same system, the interactions are a little unpredictable and challenging. So it's kind of one of those things that is best just to avoid because we don't really understand it. But certainly the short answer is often psychedelics can have either no effect in some cases or amplified effect in others. So it's really hard to get the dosage right when you're talking about people with SSRIs.
Yeah, I read many horrible trip reports of people like either taking psychedelics with SSRIs and having either no effects or like bad experiences.
Yeah.
How do you feel? Should we call in?
Yeah, it's an hour. We're honor people at times. We're 10 minutes over time, so I think honoring people would be appropriate. Perfect.
So, well, thank you so much for this incredible session, Mark. You are a wealth of useful information. And to anybody who has more questions, is there a way for them to like reach you, or like a way for like people to like get more information?
Yes. Well, I would suggest people read the guide manual. You know, most of the things we've talked about are in the guide manual. So I'm probably not going to give my email address to 239 people. You know, that's probably not going to work. But certainly the guide manual, I think, is helpful in answering most people's questions, and certainly participating in many discussion groups. I think that these kind of discussions are happening widely, and finding people who know and talking to them.
And we'll talk more about this. We have the second session of this series next Wednesday, April 14th at 5 p.m. Pacific. We will be talking with Lydia, who's a space holder and has experience dealing with this type of psychedelic sessions.
Yes.
If you haven't got your ticket, you can still buy them at the MAPS Canada website, which is www.mapscanada.org. I want to thank again our sponsors, Trip and Sport Labs, for making this event possible. And I want to also acknowledge that MAPS Canada is a charitable organization, and we do encourage donations. So if you're in a position to give, your support goes a long way in helping us work towards the legalization of psychedelics. MAPS Canada is a non-profit charity that relies entirely on public donation to help us achieve our mission of expanding safe access of psychedelic medicines for all Canadians. To learn more about MAPS Canada, you can visit our website, again, mapscanada.org. Thank you again, and I'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank you for your leadership, Antonio.
Thank you, Mark.
Your passion for this work and your leadership is noticed and appreciated. Thank you.
It's my pleasure, man.
Okay.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.